You're building a unicorn company while having a family, which means you're constantly making decisions a lot moment by moment of where your time and energy go. Can you walk me through how you think about the relationship between work and fatherhood, work and being a husband? Because most guys, I think, either romanticize having it all, being this bachelor that lives in a penthouse in New York City and doesn't have much responsibilities and can just do what he wants, when he wants, how he wants, or feeling completely torn apart by saying, I feel called to these obligations and responsibilities as a father and a husband, but not seeing those things necessarily as tying you down, but just really different roles to hold intention.
I was very fortunate to grow up with a dad that had a very successful career as a financial advisor, but never once did I feel like or any of my other siblings came secondary to his career. And I think that's very important. I think, for kids, obviously you want to be a good role model. I think it's important to show them to apply that work ethic towards your career and see for them to see you building something that you're passionate about and care about in applying that work ethic and attention to detail and all of that. But I also think it's important. I try my best to never make them feel again secondary to a career, and I think there's just no replacing time spent. I think that's just the best thing you do. So I try my absolute best to have my schedule so that I still get ample time with the kids, and I try not to let it infringe as much of when we're having family time. That time is sacred, and I try my best to keep 100% of my focus there when I am with my family. Easier said than done at times, especially now when you're always a text or a Slack message or an email away. But I think it's important to try to, the last thing I want is, the visualization of my kids just seeing me at a computer on my phone all day. When I'm with them, I try my best to isolate outside of that. But as you said, it's something I struggle with all the time. It is something that I don't have a great answer for what works best. But anybody with young kids knows, especially, it's a struggle because they're very time consuming. They want infinite time with you, and obviously you do have to be mindful of how you're balancing it all.
Yeah, I agree. It's certainly a struggle for me, even my son being 21 months old. And I believe your kids are a little older, so they're probably even more attuned. But I know he sees me on a laptop or a phone, and though he doesn't conceptualize it obviously for what it is, there's I don't know if you know much about attachment theory, but it's essentially it's an embedded psychological framework that based on how present we are or not to our kids determines how healthily attached or not attached they are. And it's something I think about a lot of that conflict because I think as we both know, we live in a society that always wants more and more and more and more. And especially for you, I'm sure seeing the potential upside of, well, if I work 10 more hours a week, what's the output I can get versus the conviction of family and faith values that you hold. I'm curious how you set boundaries and hold your feet to the fire. Obviously, I'm sure your wife kindly reminds you at times to reel it in. But for you personally, what are some things that you do that a guy could also do to kind of keep that ever perpetual work, work, work mindset at bay and really focus on what matters most?
Mm. I think in a work sense, it's like I've tried to become much more intentional and disciplined over really spending my time on what I think are genuinely the most impactful things I can be doing. Because if you don't, there is a million and one things on any given day, especially as an entrepreneur, that you could be spending your time and you could be focusing on. But I find if you have the discipline to distill that down to, the top two or three activities that you genuinely think are the most impactful, and then from a business sense, trying to in our case, grow the team and hire others to fill those gaps where you just don't have the same leverage if you're trying to do it all yourself. And we've done an amazing job of that. I mean, we have a world class team that continues to grow at ShopMy, and I think that's helpful because it frees me up to, again, spend time on things that I think are most impactful and that excite me most, and things I think I'm best suited for. And which simultaneously means that, I can afford to take the requisite time with my family and carve out that time with them, which of course is, the most important thing for anybody with young kids. So, I think that's probably the best advice on that front I could give is making sure that you're taking the time to honestly reflect on the work you're doing and ask yourself, is this the most impactful thing I could be doing at any given moment? And if not, trying your best to find others to help pick up that slack. But again, it's easier said than done. I certainly have travel obligations and things you just can't avoid that do tend to conflict with family time. Knock on wood, it's going pretty well so far.
I think that question is really challenging because it confronts the notion that more is more when that's not necessarily the case. It's actually knowing, to your point, what is the thing that's going to leverage the biggest return with the least amount of effort or output that I'm putting into it. And it takes a lot of honest and probably humbling reflection at times. And I'm curious, there's these deeper cultural messages that certainly ring in the ears of men about that real men provide, real men build, real men sacrifice, for their companies, for their families, those kind of things. And it sounds like you were lucky enough that your father actually probably went against the grain for a lot of guys his age of really both doing those traits, but doing it in a way that didn't compromise the family. I'm curious, how do you actually make those trade-off decisions day to day just to make sure like you're not neglecting and abandoning the work you feel called to at ShopMy while also continuing to make sure that your family knows that you're present and that you fulfill that role there?
Yeah, I think the best I can put is I do try to keep that family time is sacred. We have the morning drop off routine, the nighttime bedtime routine, and dinner and all that, all the standard stuff. But those specific windows, I try my absolute best to be 100% present with them. And I think that consistency helps a lot. Like again, just for me growing up, seeing my dad every morning, you're seeing him every night. I think that consistency is very important, especially for young kids and just getting that time with their parents. So for me, like those are like the most sacred times of the day. And it's like if you have to hop on to do work after they go to bed, then so be it. And in my case, I'm certainly willing and do that often. But I think you have to pick a few windows or, make a habit of regularly carving out time that is family time and in holding those sacred. I know Reed Hastings, the Netflix founder, had a habit whereby he carved, I believe it was Thursdays. Every Thursday night without fail, he had date night with his wife. Did not matter where he was, what he was doing, what was on the agenda, what was going on at the company. And obviously, they were running a massive, massive operation. He, without fail, did not miss, Thursday night date nights with his wife. And I try to think of it like that, where you have to be proactive of just carving out certain times in habits with your family that don't get encroached on no matter what, from a work perspective or otherwise.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that story because it I think it just shows that none of us are operating at that level, and if someone like that has the willpower and conviction to say no and protect his time, there's really no excuse for any of us. And I think a word that you used there, I really appreciate and resonate with is sacred. I think unless you see it as holy and set apart and something that really cannot be blemished or touched, uh, and that the boundaries you set reflect that, then we often will compromise it. And I know I struggle with that with my wife, and I imagine you have kids as well, and you feel this kind of like hamster wheel of like, man, the current can tend to pull you. And if it's not the kids, it's work or just the day-to-day demands of life. But just trusting that, yes, there's those things we have to keep up with, but often it's actually the anxiety and insecurities that make us feel like we can't stop, that we can't prioritize, and that we can't slow down to really be present to the relationships that actually anchor us the most. I know for me personally, my wife, my family is the thing that continually draws me back most to myself, most to the truth. And in times of stress and in good times, continues to be, let's say, the enoughness, I think, in my life.
Yep. No, totally agree. I think there's a reason they say that the person you marry is the most important decision you'll ever make. And I've even heard it said it's the most important business decision you'll ever make. because it is, that is, of course, my anchor and person that grounds me. And, when business gets stressful, goes up, down, sideways, like you have always that solid foundation on which to build from.
Tell me about the moment you realized that managing other people's money at Cambridge Associates wasn't your path anymore. Because a lot of men define themselves by providing and by financial stability. So, how do you reconcile taking a massive risk of leaving an opportunity like that with the responsibility you felt as a husband and father?
Yeah. So, just taking a step back from there, I had studied finance undergrad, coming out of college. And so that was the path I was on. And I really liked my time at Cambridge Associates. So it was less about leaving Cambridge and more about using business school as an opportunity to expand my purview. I think going to a small liberal arts school, I went to St. Anselm College and had a great, great experience there. I'd say the only drawback I could think of is I didn't have, I'd say, the amount of exposure into various industries and different career paths that, maybe kids have going to bigger schools and bigger institutions. So after a number of years in finance, I sort of had an itch just to explore what else was out there. And I thought the MBA program was perfectly suited for that. It's a 2-year program. You obviously, your classmates are coming from a variety of different industries and backgrounds. You're learning from them and sort of taking that time internally to reflect on, what you liked about your career and other things you might want to explore. And I thought there was a good chance that I might even end up back in finance in some role and capacity. Obviously, that ended up not being the case, but I'm obviously grateful for the time I had in MBA to just to reflect and explore other avenues.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for setting the stage there. And I'm curious how you gained a sense of clarity of what path or paths may be viable for you. I think a lot of guys look at the different options and they either think like I could never do any of it, and kind of rise to the occasion and work let's say higher functioning or higher demanding roles. And then you have people who are in these roles, but they've spent so much time dedicated to it because it requires so much that they're not able to get a sense of a path forward. So how are you able to discern that and kind of chart a path?
Yeah, I think I mean, part of the difficulty of going the entrepreneurship route is in a lot of ways you're carving your own path too. And I think that was a big struggle for me in business school because in business school there are these like very well established, well carved career paths coming out of it, namely in investment banking or management consulting. Like those are the two primary paths that students end up pursuing out of MBA. And there is so much inertia in an MBA program. It's a very competitive place and, people are vying for these very competitive jobs. And so you sort of find yourself, or at least I did during business school, sort of struggling where, you sort of get pulled in the direction of those common paths, even though I sort of knew in my heart of hearts that those weren't the right fit for me. And I wanted to take advantage of MIT. I went to Sloan for business school. I wanted to take advantage of the entrepreneurship ecosystem they had there just because it's so world renowned and they have such a world class entrepreneurship system at school. And so I wanted to explore that. I think, I've been listening to a lot of entrepreneurship podcasts, reading a lot of books going into business school. And I didn't have an idea in mind or a business in mind per se, but did have a desire to explore that. And again, getting back to, I said coming out of undergrad, that was something that I just didn't have exposure to in any real capacity beforehand. So, but it was difficult because again, you're sort of naturally, I think, keeping tabs in business school with what your classmates are doing in the career paths they're carving themselves. And, as they're landing these very competitive internships, you do start to second guess, like, am I making a massive career mistake here? Am I dropping this once in a lifetime opportunity to be at this fantastic, program at MIT and choosing to spend my time on, a much more nebulous sort of career opportunity? So, I know that was a big struggle for me. So I can certainly relate to the feeling.
Within entrepreneurship, I'm curious, it's obviously not for everyone, but I think many men out there do wonder if they're made for the 9 to 5 or if they may potentially chart their own path. as you've said, through entrepreneurship. Obviously, there's no guarantee it'll work out, but at the beginning stages, what were some telltale signs that you found in your own life that made you feel like I'm both potentially suited for this kind of path and also feel a sense of calling towards it, being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was comfort with the risk tolerance, first of all. Like, I was somebody that had a high degree of risk tolerance, when it came to career pathing. That's just something I knew about myself intuitively, and I don't think everybody feels that way about their career, but I think I was just at a point in my life where I was willing to take that risk and willing to take that bet, and I don't know if I have a good answer necessarily of how others should think about that, other than I just knew for myself that I'd be willing to take the risk. And I knew I had a very supportive wife who was also okay with me taking the risk. But I should say, you know, with that, I'll caveat that by saying, of course, it had to be something that I was really excited and passionate about, and something I think that lended itself to my skill set and interest. It wasn't just I was willing to take a complete flyer, on something. It was a little more measured than that, but I just had a feeling that if I was able to find something that I thought was compelling, that I thought had a lot of upside in terms of a business opportunity, I just knew I would be willing to make that leap of faith. For me, it was just a matter of would I be able to find something in those 2 years of business school that compelled me to do so? And if I hadn't, I think it's very likely that I would have just gone on pursuing my careers I had before business school.
Yeah. I think your point of needing to be compelled, I don't like to use the word obsession. It doesn't feel as healthy, but certainly compelled and drawn to a subject that you feel like day in and day out, you'd be willing to explore and really give yourself to in combination with the support of your wife. You bring up a good point about relationships. Many of us are in committed relationships, whether you're dating or in our cases, being married. I'm wondering what those conversations were like, coming to your wife and essentially saying, okay, as you know, here's kind of a traditional financial path and here's the stability and things that could render in that way. But I really feel called to this path. I imagine there's a bit of nerves or kind of like wondering, where it will land while also being confident that like she married you and what comes with you is also the potentiality of what you feel called to, knowing that for her it's just as big of a risk.
100%. And I think in some cases, those would be more difficult conversations than it was for us. I'm just lucky that I think my wife has just complete blind faith and confidence in what I'm doing and what I wanted to pursue. So for her, it was never even a question of the financial implications or the risk or how it could impact my career, although those are of course very real concerns. I mean, we did have conversations about just the reality of I went into this MBA program. It's a hefty six-figure program that I was paying for out of pocket, taking debt on to do so. So here you are, slated to graduate with a very unclear career path in front of you, and you just saddled up with six figures of student loan debt. It's not an easy proposition. And frankly, in some ways, I probably even underestimated like the risk in hindsight that I really was taking. But I just was so excited and passionate about it, and I think my wife could sense that. So in our case, it was never a real contentious discussion or debate. I think she just trusted that my instincts were right for me and something I wanted to do.
Yeah. And I think underneath that is the nature of love, of not trying to control, manipulate, but also holding someone accountable in the sense of limiting the potentiality to something that has realistic potential to actually succeed. But it seems like having to be confident on your end of like, hey, this really feels true to who I am. But I also feel like I have the chops, the skills, the experience to back it up, while also knowing that you got to take on a lot of cost, not just financially, but also time wise. And I imagine if something hadn't worked out, that's a big crush to the ego and obviously just in your confidence. So big risk, big reward. But it seems like at the time you didn't have obviously the foresight to see what it's turned into now, which we'll get into in a minute. But I think that sounds like that belief in yourself and that this felt like the right path forward was the things that carried you through.
Yeah, no, I'll also say, you know, eh, yeah, I'm not saying this is the right basis of a decision, but because was in business school, you sort of you take that sort of gap in your career where again you can really reflect and hone in on what you want to do in different directions you may want to take your career. And for me, it was the best opportunity to take a risk in a way because you're already accustomed to not working. You've taken 2 years off. You're sort of adapted your lifestyle to, in our case, a single income house. And, I just sort of had an intuitive sense that if I had decided to go back to my old firm or take a job at another firm, that it would never be as easy for me to then downgrade our lifestyle and take that risk years down the line. And this was still before we had kids. So I sort of knew like, hey, if there's any opportunity in life to take a stab at something, this would be it. It's easier said than done because again, you're um, caught in this whole world where everybody around you is doing the opposite pretty much. They're going out and getting these high end, high paying jobs in a variety of different industries. But again, I sort of knew that sort of that regret minimization framework you hear about. It's like I knew I'd much rather live with the idea that I took a stab at it, even if it didn't work out, than playing the what if game, for years down the road.
I think that rings true for many of us in general, existentially overall in life. I'm curious on the last question of entrepreneurship for a guy that's listening out there. Maybe he doesn't feel like he can go to business school or feel like that's the path. What are some other ways he can start to explore entrepreneurship, maybe less structured or an alternative manner?
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of entrepreneurship is just how unstructured it is. I mean, you certainly don't need to do it out of business school or out of school in general. I mean, if you listen to the entrepreneurship podcast, it so often stems from just an insight that someone had in their day to day job or something they experienced firsthand that, maybe they start exploring deeper or tinkering with a product on the side, and once they see it's viable or picks up some traction, then, they make the decision maybe to go at it full time. But I definitely think that everybody has that potential because we all experience pain points in our everyday life and we all have unique insights into different things that could be better all around you. I mean, every single day. So yeah, I think it's something that can also be done as a side project, a side hustle for a while. I don't think it necessarily has to come out of some structured school program by any means.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And the company that you co-founded, ShopMy, exists at the intersection of social media, influence, and commerce. So you're seeing what messages society, but in particular for this conversation, men are both giving and receiving online every day. I'm curious what you've actually observed about the state of male influencers and, more so the narratives that are reaching young men.
I still think there's huge potential, frankly, for male creators. I think in our company specifically, we still operate in primarily female dominated industries, and most of the creators on our platform are female, probably 90 plus percent, but we do have a good swath of male creators as well. And I think there's huge white space there for them to continue to grow because jumping back, I guess, to the initial insight that ShopMy was founded on was we had seen, and it's less novel today than it was then. But if you're on the clock 5 years ago, we were seeing just how much consumer behavior was moving to social media first as people's primary source of product inspiration and shopping decisions. Yet talking to a lot of creators firsthand just about how they were building their businesses and how they went about sharing their product recommendations. And the common refrain coming out of those conversations was just how clunky and cumbersome the underlying technology and infrastructure was for them to do something as simple as generate an affiliate link to share their favorite sweater, the jeans they're wearing, or, what have you. That I think was sort of the critical insight we saw of the technology here just had not kept pace with the growth of the market. I mean, obviously the explosion of social media happened pretty rapidly, and then naturally for just the impact it was having on commerce, what was very evident even at that time. And I still think that we're probably behind the curve a little bit, or there's so much growth ahead in terms of the what we'll see in the coming years of the male creator segment. I think it's something where now the stigma of being a creator has is certainly diminished massively. I think now people are becoming increasingly comfortable sharing themselves on social media and in sharing their thoughts and ideas and insights. And so I'm excited about that because I think it will open up a lot of doors for new creators to enter the market.
Yeah, I agree. And I think within that stigma, I think we have wrongly correlated creativity with femininity in some ways, and I think being able to step into who you are as a man and fully create, I think if we look back at history, people like Michelangelo, Galileo, these were, really Picasso, prominent male figures who not just created inventions, but also these beautiful works of art that you can just tell were so complex and yeah, just so deeply thought through and present to. And I think for a lot of men, we're hopefully bringing back this true art of creating, obviously in a way that can create a living for the people making the art. But I think that's a stigma that's fading too. I'm curious what you think. Is it also though that, men historically haven't been big purchasers as much as women of material things, and maybe that's picking up certainly, but I think more in general, maybe the way that men spend money historically would have been less on clothes, those kind of things, which maybe nowadays what people are selling on the social media shops are connected more to men and companies trying to reach men, not just making something assuming like, oh, only women will buy this thing, so we'll just make a women's line, but really making that space for men knowing that they want a place for it too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can't claim to have cracked the code on the male shopping behavior completely. What I do know is it evidently is, I think, very different than women. I think they're less accustomed the way women are to buying through creators. Just speaking from the case of ShopMy, I don't think they're yet in that rhythm. I think what we see is women consumers are much more likely to buy through create their favorite creators that they follow on social media. We try to ground our whole company and ethos into the idea that human curation in tastemakers will be the most impactful thing going forward, in terms of driving consumer behavior. And I think that applies equally to men and women. I think in the age of AI, we're going to be thrown a lot in the coming years. But our bet in our ethos is that at the end of the day, people will buy from people that they trust, and people that they trust are ones that will increasingly become less people in their immediate social circle and more people that they're finding over social media and through these other platforms. So it's something I think we'll start to see men's shopping behavior start to reflect that more and more over time.
I agree with that. There's been a lot of talk over the last few years. I think a little less now, but still strongly correlated with male influencer names. I don't know if you've heard of people like Andrew Tate or some of these more extremist views. I'm curious, what's your current take on the archetype or the main patterns of male influencers, maybe the language that they're using, key themes that they're focusing on, how they're presenting themselves? Because it's not that I don't think people listen to extreme voices like that, but my intuition is that there's a lot less people that are listening to them than I think people think. They're just the people that are just more heavily influenced. But I think it would be good to get a pulse check just to see. I don't want to call it the modern man or ask you to define that overall, but just from what you've seen, how male influences are communicating their masculinity and who they are and some messages, anything there that you would speak to?
I think as it pertains to ShopMy, I'll say what we are primarily looking for are people that we really feel like are tastemakers and bring just a high level perspective on the products and service that they're recommending and frequently talking about. I feel like naturally when we approach it from that purview, it sort of is a correcting function for it ends up serving in terms of the creators we work with. They're primarily ones that are using social media, not in any way to like promote their own masculinity or even take strong political stances or things like that. Like the ones we're primarily looking for is the corner of social media that is primarily leveraging their platform to share their taste and share their favorite things. So luckily I'd say that that steers us clear of, maybe a lot of the toxic masculinity stuff that is no doubt replete on social media. And I think again, we ground everything we do in authenticity. We're looking for people who share their authentic selves and their authentic taste. Not that that necessarily means you'll agree with everything, they'll say, but we're looking for people that have been able to curate and build sort of these high level engaged audiences who are following them primarily for their taste in their lifestyle. So tends to be a different segment, I think, of the social media world than what tends to get, popularized and make headlines.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think in a good way, it's a little more straightforward, I guess. You don't have to get caught up in the philosophical, ideological, moral side of things as much. It's a bit more straightforward with selling those things, but still wanting someone to be true to who they are. And you mentioned that the future really is, especially economically, is people really creating and offering products that feel more like on a micro level instead of, let's say, a macro level, like a massive company trying to sell things. I'm curious for a guy listening out there, statistically speaking, I know you probably don't have the exact numbers, but is it becoming more and more of a safe bet for a guy to at least take a risk and try something out to see if there's economic viability with selling a product, seeing that there is a lot of white space? Or would you still say that, given that though there is white space, it's still small, it's still a pretty big risk for a guy to jump out there and try to see if he can make money creating?
I think we now work with thousands of brands who will work with us to help build and scale and grow their creator programs. And I can just say unequivocally from those brand conversations, there is huge demand amongst brands to partner with male creators. I think they know that they bring a unique perspective, a unique audience. And our contention is that creators are really the modern day retailers. If you think about it, they're the ones curating products, curating brands, and they've become this really increasingly important distribution channel now for brands, the way retailers were a number of years ago, if you rewind the clock. So I think we see brands who are increasingly interested in finding new talent to work with on this basis. And again, I think there's a huge opportunity for male creators to get more active and start to build their audience. I think there's no better time to do it. I mean, there's obviously such a myriad of different platforms, different formats that you can get involved with, from YouTube, TikTok, Substack, Instagram, you name it. So I think there's no better time to start road testing some of that a little bit and start to build your audience and see what resonates with them. Yeah, I think there's tremendous opportunity there.
Yeah, that gives me a lot of hope. I mean, I obviously fall into that category as someone who's shooting a shot in that manner. But, I think a lot of men are wanting to feel like who they are and the experiences that they have day to day can be modeled and seen in society more and more, in a way where people can offer something that feels like genuinely helpful or considerate of men. And I think, previously, as we both know, there has been some ostracization. And of course, some of that's justified of not wanting to, condone bad behavior. But overall, I think the average man who really is earnestly trying to express who he is looking for those messages and narratives and products and companies that he can relate to. And, it seems like there's a big potential, and more brands are realizing it. Half the population, though the consumer spending is allocated a lot different, nonetheless, it's really an untapped market that seems to be more and more considered.
Yeah, and beyond just the economic opportunity, I mean, you have obviously social media itself, I think, is as popular among male consumers as female consumers. And it does feel like there's probably, a real dearth of male creators that fit the bill, somebody that you think is using social media the right way, putting forth a positive message, things that you want to emulate. I mean, there's certainly, I think, there's no shortage of opportunity there, I think, for males to have that level of connection and inspiration on social media. We just got to hope more people get active in the space like yourself that are putting out good messages for people.
I'm curious if you've had a rubber meets the road moment where you had to choose between a major business opportunity and being present with your family or valuing some of those. And what do you learn about yourself in that decision or that tension?
I feel it most acutely on travel. At ShopMy, we work with creators all over the country, brands all over the country, internationally. We have 10% of our creator base is based in the UK. So there's no shortage of opportunities to travel justifiably for, business development, go meet clients face to face, develop that rapport and expand the relationship. But again, it's something that I've learned to just be very selective of you know, where I'm taking advantage of those opportunities and where I just have to live with the fact that you can't be, on a plane every weekend flying all around the country or internationally when I have young kids at home that, need me and want their father figure present. I think that for me is when it comes up most acutely. And as a result, I've taken a step back in terms of the travel I do, whereas, in the very, very early stages of building the business, it was necessary to be on the road a lot. But again, now I just take a much more measured approach to how I personally go about it.
Something you said in the last conversation we had last summer that really struck me is you were saying how much of both your investor base naturally with the place where that is being very important as well as the creator base being in New York City was a place that you could very easily live and actually be easier in a lot of ways when it came to meetings, but you actually had told me just in kind of a very matter of fact, but really confident and calm, and grounded manner that, hey, where I live in this, smaller town that's not even near a big city, where you're from is actually the place you felt most called, and then above the convenience of being able to have that, for lack of a better term, sexy entrepreneurship lifestyle that would be more convenient living in a city like New York. That you bypass that to actually stay and invest locally and live what, for all things considered, would be a pretty normal life. And that just really struck me. That kind of goes along with this thread.
I appreciate that. I think for me growing up, I grew up in a small town, but in a very tight knit family, where I have a lot of brothers. They all live in Massachusetts. We grew up very close to our cousins and we're seeing them all the time. And, for me, proximity to family is extremely important. And I want my kids to have that same experience growing up. I've just been very blessed with a great close knit family and value the time with them tremendously. And, the last thing I'd want to do is to make a business decision that I think came with substantial sacrifice to their experience and upbringing. And, to me, that is the most important thing to try to structure around. So, yeah, we made a conscious decision to structure our life around proximity to family first and foremost. And obviously, in our case, growing up in an area of the state that we think provide just a very nice, balanced upbringing for our kids and a nice atmosphere for them to grow up in. I'm biased because it closely mirrors, my own. I'm from Central Massachusetts originally, and that's where we live now. But I guess I feel very, very, strongly on that view. So, yeah, I appreciate that aligns with yourself and seems to resonate with yourself too.
Yeah, definitely, man. And I think it goes against the grain of what we would consider the common path for an entrepreneur or someone going on the hero's journey. We have this, I think, illustrious yet not necessarily grounded in reality, fantasy of, you have to like move away and you have to like find yourself in a big city and you have to just like risk it all and leave your whole family. I'm not saying that's not a true path for some people. Some people don't have that same setup or cohesion or health within their family, and oftentimes some people do feel stuck and they need to leave. But you know what people don't understand about the that hero's journey framework by Joseph Campbell, for those who aren't aware, is that ironically we only leave home only to in a sense return to it. You know, in the Odyssey, Odysseus, one of the famous last lines in the story is, now that I've left home, I finally know what home means. And it seems like you are living that and emulating it, which is really grounding yourself in traditional, I'm not tying that to political, just purely traditional, ritualistic almost values of really investing in your community, being close to the people that raised you. And again, I think in a day and age, we think that we can do it without each other. There's this hyper self reliance. And the reality is, I'm sure you've experienced this. I have with my in laws of like, man, there's so many times that family has jumped in and been the support system that I need, that we need, and certainly wouldn't allow me to do the things that I do without having that. But most of all, I think it keeps you accountable to something beyond yourself. You know, it's important to focus on walking your path, but I'm sure you've experienced this when you're with your family. They don't see you as, you know, ShopMy founder Chris. You know, you're just Chris, whether that's the brother or the son or the friend or the cousin. And in some ways, I imagine that's at least psychologically stable and really helpful.
Exactly. You know, and it's something you don't understand how much you really need that community again until you have young kids, and scenarios pop up all the time where you really need somebody to lend a hand, step in, whether it's an errand or anything under the sun. As just the number of situations that get thrown at you. And so again, we're very fortunate to have that support system around us. And yeah, it's something we've wanted to keep that way.
You were the commencement speaker at your alma mater, St. Anselm, which is a Catholic Benedictine college. So faith formation was obviously clearly significant for you then and is now. I'm curious how that worldview, that ideology actually shows up and informs how you're making business decisions, especially around the ethics of helping creators monetize and also be influential.
Yeah, I think all my siblings, we all went to Catholic liberal arts colleges. Is something my dad felt very strongly about, and I'm very glad because I do think it gives me the foundation in lens of which I look at everything, business included. Um, one of the things the Catholic Church preaches specifically is, from a work perspective, is offering jobs and trying to make careers that reflect the humanity and dignity of the human person. I think, we've tried to instill that at ShopMy as best we can for our own internal team of we always say we want ShopMy to be the best place that they ever worked. And we mean that in every regard, just not just financially, but their own professional growth, how they're treated, how they're viewed, and in all of that. And I think that's something that again, I think we've done a pretty good job, but there's always room for improvement on. And I think from the creator's perspective, one of the things we saw earlier on was we saw creators having an outsized impact in terms of how much influence and how much impact they were having on people's purchasing decisions, but in a way that we didn't think adequately reflected or they were adequately compensated for the impact that they were having. And I think it's because they didn't have the right tooling, and they didn't have the right infrastructure and commercial infrastructure to back it up and to support them as creators and support them as business owners. And I think that was something we felt very strongly about and passionate about, was the idea that we wanted creators to get adequately rewarded for the impact and work they were doing. And that was our core to our mission statement from day one, and continues to be. And yeah, very proud of, we'll get messages all the time from creators of, now I can do more of what I love to do. I'm now able to pay my rent or pay my mortgage or, what have you, thanks to ShopMy and, the earning potential that they've found on the platform. And we now have close to 200,000 creators on the platform, and that's growing week over week. And yeah, it's probably the thing that I get most excited about is when anytime you receive messages around that fact. So
I think there's this misunderstanding that spirituality, but particularly Christianity, I think is either this like you have to take a vow of poverty. You can't, you kind of have to suffer and you can't really make baseline and you have to kind of, yeah, give it all up. Or, you know what we're seeing nowadays too. I mean, thank goodness it's not as much in Catholicism, but in a lot of Protestant sects is this hyper consumerism where, you know, we kind of overly saturate you know, making money and spending it with spirituality. But it seems like what you're offering is a third path, which is using the spiritual principle of dignifying the human person like Christ would, and allowing them to make money, but in a way that makes them as a person better, more whole, and able to make a more positive impact on the world.
That was so well said, I might be stealing that. So, yes, exactly.
While it seems like you've done a really good job of holding these things in tension of living out your faith and your role as an entrepreneur, I'm sure there are times when they do conflict to a degree. Can you tell me about a specific moment where you were living out those values in your faith and it cost you something, maybe in business terms, whether it's revenue growth or an opportunity that you maybe had to walk away from?
We are still an invitation only platform or application only. And we made the conscious decision to put in those guardrails because we wanted to be protective of our own brand and protective of those who we work with. And I think, in some cases we've had incidents where, it maybe made business sense to work with a certain creator, certain digital talent, but we just couldn't get over some of their other viewpoints and just philosophical differences that were out there. And those are cases where, yeah, in a lot of cases we had to make the difficult decision, but we feel very strongly we want to be protective of the ShopMy community, especially as it scales, and just make sure that we're working with creators that we think reflect our own values, the ones we just touched upon. So certainly a case where sometimes you're putting business second and putting your ethics first and foremost.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and again, in a world where I think, unfortunately, many people are willing to do whatever it takes to make a quick buck and to make money or be exposed, it really comes back to the values and convictions which ground you to help remind you that, you know, as tempting as that is, you know, the reference point here being Jesus tempted in the wilderness, there needs to be some sort of deeper truth or trust that allows you to face those temptations, but just know that you don't have to give them to them. That you know the provision and the opportunities will certainly come beyond what you're currently rejecting or resisting. And in that moment, I'm sure it's difficult because you see those dollar signs. You like try to justify it. Well, maybe it can work. But I think what you brought up is a good point for anyone listening is, you know, there's no price you can pay for a clear conscience. And if there's still some sort of unsettledness within your spirit, within yourself, whatever you want to call it, you know, you have to pay attention to that because that thing is your true north, is the thing that's going to guide you onto the truth and to follow that in a way that's not going to bring immediate gratification, but certainly, you know, long term peace.
The old adage that it takes years and years and years to build a reputation and can take a nanosecond to destroy it holds true, especially in the day of social media and virality in the industry, we operate in. So, it's something we're very protective of, our own brand and own reputation.
If you were to leave a core message or tips or advice for any young guy listening out there, you know, what would you say?
Every night, part of our bedtime routine, we always say to our kids is the three G's. It's God, gratitude, and grit. We try to implore God comes always first and foremost. Gratitude, I obviously think it's just incredibly important to be grateful for all the blessings you have and all the blessings that God has given us. And then grit, we always say you got to be a little tough in this world. So I'd say if you're getting those three things right and in order, you're on a good path. So those are the things that we try to ground our family in.
Cool. Well, I may return the favor and maybe taking that for sure. And, you know, it's often the most simple truths that are the most powerful and foundational. So, Chris, thanks for sharing your wisdom today. You know, outside of ShopMy. Just appreciate the work that you're doing as a human and giving yourself, yeah, to worthwhile missions and emulating what it means to be a mature man. So thank you again for joining.
I appreciate Wes. Thank you for having me. This was awesome. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Guys, until next time.
Awesome.